Welcome to POTUS 2017, where we keep watch on the Oval Office and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Today, the end of ethics. We'll dig into the many still unresolved White House conflicts of interest. Then, in our evidence-based politics segment, look at a study that computes how many dollars it takes to reverse a Congress member's vote. But first, the Republican elephant in the room. As we all know by now, President Trump has fired FBI Director James Comey, who is leading the criminal investigation into whether Trump's campaign colluded with Russia to tilt the 2016 election. The administration claims the firing stems from Comey's handling of the Hillary Clinton email investigation. He chose not to prosecute her twice, as you know. But the president, his letter firing Comey, alludes not to the Clinton matter, but to the Russia inquiry. Take a look. The official pink slip signed by Trump thanks Comey for informing him 3 times that he, the president, was not under investigation. Then Trump fires him. But why fire Comey now? Turns out, according to congressional sources, the now former FBI director had just asked his boss, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, for more resources for the Russia inquiry. Days later, it was Rosenstein's memo used to justify the firing. That's not clear evidence of meddling in an investigation, but it is more fuel on the fire. To react to all this startling news and to dig deep into various alleged conflicts of interest, joining us via Skype from Washington, Robert Walker, former chief counsel and staff director of the Senate and House Ethics Committees. He's now an attorney with the D.C. firm Wiley Rein. And with us as well, Justin Elliott from the investigative reporting team ProPublica, where he covers politics and money and other matters. Welcome, both of you, to the program.
Good to be here.
Let me go first to Washington. Given your experience in Congress, are your eyes popping out of your head seeing what's going on here with Comey?
Well, look, I was alive and around for Watergate, the Saturday Night Massacre precedent that a lot of people are citing. I think this is a comparable kind of earthquake moment. And I think much of what's been said in the public back and forth about this are sentiments that I share. First of all, Director Comey, throughout his career, has been a very dedicated public servant, doing some very difficult jobs, including, obviously, as director of FBI. Having said that, those who have been critical of him for some of his conduct in connection with the election, I don't think those are unreasonable positions that these folks have been taking. They're not unreasonable criticisms or positions to take. But with all that said, the timing of this is just not just inexplicable, but problematic, highly problematic.
What are you thinking as you watch this?
I mean, I think obviously the biggest question right now is what actually sparked the firing now at this moment, and I think the reporting on that is still unclear. But a couple of the biggest things that I'm looking out for are, one, who is Trump going to try to put in Comey's job? Who's he going to hire to run the FBI? Is it going to be somebody who's a Trump loyalist, or is it going to be somebody that could be expected to pursue, in particular, the Russia investigation into the administration aggressively and without, with objectivity? And the second question is Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein going to appoint a special prosecutor to take over that investigation? And my understanding of the rules as they exist right now is that person, if such a prosecutor were appointed, would have some more independence from Attorney General Sessions and Trump, but actually not complete independence. So I think those are two things to watch out for going forward.
Mr. Walker, since the Ethics Committee deals in conflicts of interest, and we know the Attorney General recused himself from the Russia and the campaign investigation because he was caught failing to disclose to Congress when he was asked point blank at his confirmation hearings about any contacts that he had himself. Does conflict of interest come into play in Sessions' recommendation to the president that he fire Comey? If he was supposed to have been recused from the Russia investigation, and I realize that's not the only thing the FBI director does, but it's obviously so prominent in this context, did he violate his recusal?
Well, that's a good and interesting question. I think there are probably plenty of arguments to come down on the side that he did. Having said that, I think there are a whole host of problems with this decision and the action of firing the director that kind of leave the conflict of interest question in the dust in that way. And also, obviously, the involvement of Rod Rosenstein, separately and independently of Attorney General Sessions, is at least one mechanism or an attempted mechanism to kind of avoid that conflict of interest. Rod Rosenstein is a highly praised prosecutor. Everyone who I know who has worked with him and knows him has high regard for his independence. It's a difficult and tough spot he was put in here and will be put in. But one question that someone posed to me today I thought was an interesting one. Not only is this time to ask whether or not a special counsel should be appointed, but will this action, the firing of Director Comey, also be an impetus, a renewed impetus for an independent public commission to look into allegations regarding Russia and the elections? And the question is, which would be a better mechanism to get at the truth here and to vindicate what needs to be vindicated? A special counsel or an independent public commission? It was an interesting question posed to me.
What's the best vehicle for a true independent inquiry?
I think the independent commission would be the better mechanism here for getting at the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And assuming that testimony could be taken by the commission in such a way that it would not prevent or impede future prosecutions if necessary, then there could be follow-on prosecutions. But given the climate that's been created, I think, by the firing of Director Comey, it may be that the independent public commission is really the better way to go here.
Yeah,
if there is
that
support.
would be like the 9/11 Commission, led by two sort of elder statesmen who were no longer actively in government, as opposed to a special counsel, Justin, who is still kind of reporting to the Justice Department. Do you come to the same conclusion?
I'm not sure I have an opinion on that question, but the special counsel rules, as I understand them, were reformed in the late 90s after the Ken Starr era, and the current possible hypothetical special counsel would be able to do their work independently, wouldn't be giving updates to either the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General, but ultimately, as I understand it, would be fireable by Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein. Right. So, but, if you play out the hypothetical and think if even if they're technically fireable, firing that person, if that person ever exists, would be a whole other level compared to this Comey situation.
All right, let's move on to conflicts of interest. It is quite a list. The Atlantic magazine did a good job of compiling the list. We put it to music. And the carousel goes round and round. Justin, do you have a favorite one on that list?
Oh, man. My personal favorite would be the Jared Kushner family connections with China, and there's actually been now 2 rounds of stories about that. The first involved his family or his actual personal wooing of a large Chinese company with connections to the Chinese government for a real estate deal involving a large office building here in Manhattan. And the second round just broke this week, involved Jared Kushner's sister actually traveling to China and pitching Chinese investors on giving money to a Kushner, another real estate project in New Jersey, in exchange for this special type of visa.
And
that's raised a lot of questions.
What's the problem there? If the term we're using is conflict of interest, here is a family that was very involved in business. It's either unique or at least unusual in American history for a president to come from, from that background. They say it's hard to divest of everything. Even if they put everything into a blind trust, they would still know that it's the Trump organization or Jared Kushner's particular real estate company that was making them money. So how does it affect the public other than that we tisk, tisk, tisk?
It's a good question. I think there's sort of two potential sides to every conflict of interest story. The first side is a sort of just basic corruption, using your public office for your personal gain, that the conflict of interest rules are designed to prevent. But then the other side of it, which I think is arguably, potentially at least more troubling for members of the public, is if for example, Jared Kushner is seeking to do a business deal with a company, in this case it was Anbang, that has connections to the Chinese state. So he's in a negotiation with this company, but this Chinese company and the Kushner business. Then he's trying to get good terms from that company. Is that negotiation going to spill over into his public role as President Trump's top advisor on a whole range of issues, including foreign policy issues? And is that going to color his advice on China policy? So I think those are the two sides to all of these issues. And, all of these Kushner issues and the Trump issues flow from the fact that both of them declined to divest their assets, meaning sell their business and put it into a blind trust, convert it into things like treasury bonds or index funds where you own the whole S&P 500 and there's no specific conflict with your business interests. Both President Trump, who's actually not bound by the conflict of interest laws, and Jared Kushner, who is, as a government employee, have not divested most of their business assets. So that's why we keep hearing about this.
Mr. Walker, there's at least one lawsuit that has to do with the president allegedly violating the emoluments clause of the Constitution, which has to do with not allowing federal government employees to take money from foreign governments. So can you explain it, and do you see that lawsuit as having merit?
Well, let's see if I can explain it. I first want to say, with regard to Jared Kushner,
sure.
And all I know is what I read in the papers, if people still read the papers. But I think he has done a fair amount of divesting of his assets. I'm sure there are assets he hasn't divested, but I don't think his divestment situation is comparable to President Trump's. And I think there are recusals and divesting that has gone on there. I can't speak to the scope of it, but that's what I understand from public reports.
Well, then what about what Justin mentioned a minute ago, which is that the president is actually not subject to these laws? Why is the president of the United States exempt from conflict of interest laws?
The conflict of interest regime in the executive branch is one of you either recuse or disqualify yourself from a matter that might affect your financial interest, or you have to divest that financial interest so that there is no current possible effect on your personal finances. A third alternative would be to get a waiver from the agency ethics official. That mechanism theoretically works for an official in a specific agency, let's say the Secretary of Energy, the scope of whose official responsibilities is focused in the energy sector. Supposed logic, as I was saying, with regard to the president, is, hey, his official responsibilities are all-encompassing on matters in all areas of policy. Therefore, he would either have to recuse from all areas or divest from all areas.
But he's not exempt from the emoluments clause of the Constitution, right?
He is not.
Right. Although we do know, as a matter of politics, I'll just throw in as an aside that this is a transactional president who has said that he wouldn't press the currency manipulation case against China because they'd help with North Korea, which is unrelated. So who knows what other deals he might make. We're going to run out of time for this segment, but I just want to touch on one other thing with you, Justin, which is that Trump had promised to ban lobbyists or restrict lobbyists from having influence in the government. In some ways, he ran on draining the swamp, as he put it. Has it been done?
No. In fact, we've seen a complete 180 reversal from both the sort of general rhetoric of the Trump campaign about draining the swamp, running against sort of establishment and Washington and financial elites, and in fact, violations of promises that he made. I mean, he said at one point he'd have no problem banning lobbyists. My colleagues and I obtained a list of several hundred officials that the Trump administration hired at various agencies like the Department of Defense, EPA, that sort of thing. And based on our conservative count, he's hired around at least 40 lobbyists. Many of these people are working on the exact same issues in the government that they were lobbying on for companies and trade associations. Trump actually loosened the Obama-era rules on which sort of people, lobbyists, could come into the administration.
Loosened the rules.
He loosened the rules. It used to be that under Obama, if you'd lobbied an agency in the last 2 years, you couldn't go to work at that agency. Trump changed that through an executive order to say you could go and work at that agency as long as you didn't work on the particular issues that you had been lobbying on. But they've actually gone even beyond that and been issuing waivers secretly from their own loosened rules. So it's been a complete reversal from all of the campaign rhetoric.
Trump said he would no longer make public the White House visitor logs.
Right.
Who's signing in to visit the White House. Now, I understand you've used those logs in the past as an investigative reporter?
That's right, yeah. I mean, this is a topic dear to my heart as a reporter. The Obama administration actually had to be dragged kicking and screaming to publish these. I believe there was actually a lawsuit in the early Obama years. And then to their credit, they did. Any member of the public could go on the website and you could just look up, John Smith went to the White House this day and visited X official. I used this, just to give you an example, in a long story I did last year investigating the Obama administration's approval of a controversial airline merger. So this was me investigating, this Democratic administration, and I found, meetings between airline executives and administration officials, that sort of thing, which really helped bolster the reporting. So I believe there has been a lawsuit filed over this, or if there hasn't been, somebody's planning to. So hopefully this gets reversed, or they, see the light.
So, Mr. Walker, what about the term the swamp? When they say drain the swamp, there seems to be some different interpretations of what that means. We thought it meant corporate lobbyists during the campaign, the finance sector, the Wall Street sector especially, but also corporate lobbyists. Trump actually used the hashtag drain the swamp when he was tweeting about his firing of Comey. So I didn't realize the FBI director was the swamp. I thought it was more companies. When you were working at the ethics committees in the House and the Senate, was the swamp a term that you used?
No. I think the fact that the waiver process under the Trump Ethics Pledge is not going to be public, that doesn't help get rid of the swamp stigma. And the problem with the waiver process under the Trump Ethics Pledge is that we don't know how many waivers have been issued. Could be 0, could be 100. The same problem as that now, not knowing who is visiting the White House. I think that approach is short-sighted, that if there are going to be waivers, let's at least have some transparency. In the long term, knowing what the waivers are is going to be less harmful to the perception of ethics in this administration than the sense that they are just stonewalling on this waiver issue. I think they ought to reverse that policy and make the waivers public.
Mr. Walker, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Justin Elliott's going to stay with us as we bring on some additional evidence. Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. Even if you sense it, know it, swear by it, it's another thing to quantify and conclude scientifically that money is corrupting Washington. Many political scientists have been hesitant to reduce legislative decisions to a financial exchange. But a new study suggests the data is in and clear. The study by the Roosevelt Institute think tank looked at members of Congress who broke with their own parties on two issues: financial reform and net neutrality. The study found that House members were increasingly likely to break ranks after receiving increasing amounts of campaign contributions from the finance and telecom industries. Paul Jorgensen will explain. He is professor of political science at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, and co-author of the study 50 Shades of Green: High Finance, Political Money, and the U.S. Congress. He joins us via Skype from Rio Grande Valley, Texas. Justin Elliott from ProPublica stays with us. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
And a large part of your paper, I see, focused on Democrats who voted for Dodd-Frank, but later broke with their party on amendments to modify the law. What happened?
Well, that's right. Well, we focus on those particular incumbents because you can control for a lot of the normal factors that, or excuses that folks use to say money doesn't matter. So what happened was basically they get a lot of money from finance to break ranks and vote for these very specific amendments like the swaps push out, in-user manipulations.
Can you put that into lay terms? Give us one good concrete example.
Sure. The swaps push out. So the idea in Dodd-Frank was that banks, commercial banks, or any financial institution that is eligible for taxpayer money or federal dollars in assistance from the FDIC or the Federal Reserve should not engage in swap deals, whether selling or buying of these insurance type of instruments or hedge instruments that are simply used for speculation in Wall Street.
Right. And too many of those are what was seen to have contributed to weakening the mortgage market and making it look stronger than it actually was. Right. So they voted to preserve even those kinds of swaps in the context of the larger Dodd-Frank bill. And one of the factors in the paper is whether a House member was near the end of his or her term. The nearer the end of the term, the more likely they were to break ranks. One would think that if they were nearing re-election, they would want to be able to campaign to their constituents that I stuck with my values. Why not?
Well, we can speculate on why that's an important variable. So it's not just folks who were nearing the end of their term. It was folks who just lost re-election. They may have retired, or more importantly, a few of them are moving on to the Senate. So you have folks who are raising money that would make it more likely to vote with the Republican Party on repealing measures of Dodd-Frank. But you also have a revolving door phenomenon that is extremely prevalent in the finance industry itself. And revolving door simply means that once you leave Congress, you're going to go take a job in the very industry that you're supposed to regulate.
So you actually quantified this. So tell our viewers, what does $100,000 buy when the recipient is a member of Congress?
Yeah, it increases the probability that the Democrat will break and vote a different way than they originally voted. So you take the Democrats who voted for Dodd-Frank and you follow their voting pattern for the next number of years where they're repealing measures of Dodd-Frank in the House. And $100,000 gets you about a 14% more likely probability that they're going to vote with the banks.
Justin?
I had a question. So were you able to tell through the data set whether the money was causing the vote change or the more likelihood that the vote would change, or whether these donors were simply donating to those Democrats who happen to be of like mind with the companies on these regulatory issues? I mean, how can one suss that out, or is it not possible?
Right. Well, it's possible to mitigate from some of those correlation causation issues. So that's a classic question in political science, and for the most part, political scientists would say that you can't tease those out. However, if you look at the quality research designs in the past and try to mimic those, we show similar findings to those past studies. And this is why it's important to find the same incumbent who votes one way on a particular issue and find similar roll call votes, clean votes, more precisely, votes about one particular issue are the best, and see how they change their vote, right, over time. So if you have the same person, you're holding a lot constant there. You're holding the district more or less constant, even with redistricting in some cases. You're holding ideology relatively constant, and you're holding this sort of precondition or the preference to vote for Wall Street constant. So if they vote one way and change their mind, what kind of change would correlate or cause that change of heart?
We have less than a minute. Justin, is this knowledge actionable in any way in Washington?
Yeah, well, I'm actually wondering whether the professor thinks, is there some sort of solution proposed? I mean, sort of restrictions on campaign donations and that kind of thing, or you think it's something that people should just be aware of when they're, voting for their representative?
Well,
30 seconds, Professor.
Yeah, very, very quickly. It's very hard. The Democrats tend to vote as a bloc, but if they break away, how do you hold them accountable? So the message of the paper would be campaign finance pervades a lot of issues in this way. And if you want to get traction on climate change, financial reform, and the like, let's start thinking about campaign finance reform.
All right. Money is the root of all evil. It's now proven scientifically and mathematically. Thank you both very much for joining us today. And that's POTUS 2017 for today. We are here each week at this hour, keeping an eye on the Oval Office and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.